Dearest listeners, there exists in the grand theater of human folly no spectacle quite so magnificent as a rake attempting reformation, whilst a lady of gentle birth masquerades as her own inferior. Today, your humble chronicler brings you the most extraordinary tale of hidden nobility meeting reformed libertinage in the drawing rooms of Mayfair. But let us not rush, for the best stories, like the finest Madeira, must be savored properly. The autumn of 1817 brought with it a peculiar chill to the elegant townhouse on Brook Street, where Miss Evangeline Beaumont occupied a position as disagreeable as it was necessary. At 21, she possessed the unfortunate combination of refined features that spoke of gentle breeding and circumstances that demanded she suppress every evidence of such patrimony. Her morning ritual began before dawn in the servants' quarters, though her duties placed her in that precarious realm between stairs, neither truly servant nor family, but that most pitiable of creatures, a poor relation dependent upon charity. The household of Sir Reginald Fortescue and his wife, Lady Margaret, represented the worst excesses of new money attempting to purchase respectability. Sir Reginald had acquired his baronetcy through the judicious lending of funds to the crown during the late conflict with Bonaparte, and his lady wife had brought a considerable dowry from her father's Manchester mills. Their 3 daughters, Helena, Cordelia, and the youngest Isabel, had been thrust into London society with all the subtlety of cannon fire, their every appearance calculated to secure advantageous marriages that would elevate the family's standing amongst the ton. Evangeline's role in this ambitious scheme was to serve as companion, confidant, and chaperone to the Fortescue daughters, whilst maintaining the fiction that she was merely a distant cousin fallen upon hard times. The truth of her parentage was known only to Sir Reginald, who had been persuaded by circumstances most compelling to provide her shelter in exchange for her services. She had arrived at Brook Street 3 years prior, carrying nothing but a small valise and a letter of introduction that Sir Reginald had read with expressions ranging from surprise to calculation to resigned acceptance. The letter had spoken of her late mother's connection to his family, though it had been deliberately vague about the precise nature of that relationship. What it had made abundantly clear was that Evangeline possessed an education befitting a lady of quality. She spoke French and Italian with fluency, played the pianoforte with considerable skill, and had been tutored in all the accomplishments deemed essential for a woman of breeding. More importantly for Sir Reginald's purposes, she understood the intricate protocols of polite society with an instinctive grace that his daughters, despite their expensive education, had failed to acquire. Lady Margaret had accepted Evangeline's presence with the grudging acknowledgement that such a companion might prove useful in navigating the treacherous waters of the marriage mart. However, she had been quite explicit about the boundaries of that acceptance. Evangeline was to dress modestly, speak only when addressed, and never forget that her position depended entirely upon the family's continued goodwill. She was provided with a small chamber on the 3rd floor, meals with the upper servants, and a quarterly allowance so modest that it barely covered her most basic necessities. The arrangement might have been bearable had it not been for the particular cruelties that Lady Margaret and her daughters delighted in inflicting upon one they considered beneath them, yet suspected might be their superior in all the qualities that truly mattered. Helena, the eldest at 19, possessed her mother's calculating nature and her father's tendency towards spite. She took particular pleasure in assigning Evangeline the most tedious and menial tasks, always with the sweetest of smiles and the most poisonous of words. On this particular morning, as October rain drummed against the windows of the breakfast parlor, Evangeline stood behind Helena's chair, carefully arranging the elaborate coiffure that would showcase the family's newest acquisition, a set of emerald hairpins that had cost Sir Reginald more than most families saw in a year. Helena's reflection in the looking-glass wore an expression of supreme satisfaction as she contemplated her appearance. Lady Margaret consulted her morning correspondence with the air of a general planning a campaign. The social calendar for the autumn season required careful navigation, particularly as rumors had been circulating about certain eligible gentlemen who might soon be seeking wives. Chief among these was Damien Covington, Viscount Greystone, whose recent return to London after several years of exile on the continent had set every ambitious mamma's heart aflutter. The whispers surrounding Lord Greystone were deliciously scandalous. His reputation as a rake of the first order had been firmly established during his salad days, when his exploits with married ladies and opera singers had provided the ton with endless entertainment. His sudden departure from England 3 years prior had been attributed to a duel over the wife of a prominent politician, though the exact details remained shrouded in mystery. What was known with certainty was that his father's recent death had left him with a title, an ancient estate in Derbyshire, and debts that threatened to swallow both. For Lady Margaret, Lord Greystone represented opportunity incarnate. His need for a wealthy bride was common knowledge, and Helena's considerable dowry made her a viable candidate despite the family's recent elevation. The challenge lay in securing an introduction and creating circumstances that would allow Helena's charms to work their intended magic. Evangeline listened to these machinations with the careful attention that her position required, filing away each detail for future reference while maintaining the blank expression that had become her shield against the world's casual cruelties. She had learned to make herself invisible during such discussions, to become a piece of furniture that happened to possess ears and hands useful for arranging hair or mending tears in delicate fabrics. Yet as Lady Margaret read aloud from a letter describing Lord Greystone's expected appearance at Lady Pemberton's soirée the following evening, something stirred within Evangeline's carefully guarded heart. She had heard whispers of this particular nobleman during her occasional ventures to Hatchard's bookshop, where the lending library served as an unofficial clearinghouse for society gossip. The portrait painted by these whispers was of a man touched by tragedy and hardened by experience, yet possessed of an intelligence and wit that set him apart from the usual run of fashionable gentlemen. The morning's toilette complete, Helena dismissed Evangeline with a wave of her jeweled hand, already turning her attention to the selection of her evening gown. As Evangeline made her way to the small sitting room where she conducted her lessons with Isabel, the youngest Fortescue daughter, she found herself wondering what manner of man could inspire such devoted scheming amongst the ambitious mammas of Mayfair. Her afternoon was occupied with the usual routine of accomplishments and improvements. Isabel, at 16, possessed more natural sweetness than her elder sisters, though she had been effectively cowed by her mother's relentless criticism and her siblings' casual cruelties. During their French conversation, Evangeline detected a wistfulness in the girl's manner that spoke of dreams beyond the narrow confines of advantageous marriage. As evening approached and the household prepared for Lady Pemberton's soirée, Evangeline found herself assigned the task of attending to Helena's final preparations. The emerald silk gown had been chosen to complement the new hairpins, and Lady Margaret had decreed that every detail must be perfect. Evangeline's skilled fingers arranged the delicate silk roses that adorned the bodice, each adjustment made under Helena's critical gaze. The irony of her situation was not lost upon her. Here she stood, possessed of breeding that equaled if not surpassed that of her employers, reduced to playing lady's maid to a merchant's daughter whose every gesture betrayed her origins. Yet Evangeline had learned to find dignity in the performance of her duties, to take pride in skills that few ladies of quality possessed, and to maintain her inner sense of worth despite the daily humiliations that were her lot. As the Fortescue carriage rolled away into the gas-lit streets of Mayfair, bearing its cargo of ambition and calculation toward Lady Pemberton's drawing rooms, Evangeline retired to her small chamber with a book borrowed from Hatchard's, a volume of poetry that spoke of love and honor in language that elevated the soul above the mere circumstances of birth or fortune. She could not have known that across the city, in the elegant chambers of a house in Grosvenor Square, another soul was preparing to enter her orbit, carrying with him the power to transform her carefully constructed world in ways both wonderful and terrible. Lady Pemberton's soirée possessed all the hallmarks of a gathering calculated to impress the most discerning members of the ton. The drawing rooms of her mansion in Berkeley Square had been opened en suite, creating a flowing river of silk and satin that moved between chambers decorated with the finest examples of modern taste. Crystal chandeliers cast their golden light upon walls adorned with portraits by Lawrence and Reynolds, while footmen in powder and livery moved with practiced efficiency among guests whose names read like a page from Debrett's peerage. Evangeline had not expected to attend such an evening, Yet circumstances had conspired to alter her usual routine of solitary reflection. Isabella had suffered a sudden indisposition that Lady Margaret deemed suspicious. The girl had been displaying a worrying tendency toward romantic sensibilities that her mother feared might interfere with practical matrimonial arrangements. Rather than risk leaving Helena without proper supervision, Lady Margaret had decreed that Evangeline should accompany the family in Isabella's stead, albeit with strict instructions regarding her behavior and deportment. The compromise required careful negotiation of social boundaries. Evangeline was to attend as companion rather than family member, maintaining a respectful distance while remaining available should Helena require assistance with her toilet or need rescue from unwelcome attention. Her dress for the occasion had been selected with Lady Margaret's usual attention to maintaining proper distinctions. A gown of dove-gray silk that had once belonged to Helena but had been deemed insufficiently fashionable for the current season. Though the color was somber for one of her years, the quality of the fabric and the elegance of its construction could not be entirely disguised, lending Evangeline an air of quiet distinction that she hoped would not attract unwanted notice. The evening began according to Lady Margaret's carefully orchestrated plan. Helena, resplendent in her emerald silk, was presented to the most eligible gentleman present with the kind of determined efficiency that had built Sir Reginald's commercial empire. Evangeline took her appointed position near the wall, close enough to observe, but far enough removed to avoid the impression of presumption. From this vantage point, she could study the intricate dance of social interaction that governed such gatherings, noting the subtle hierarchies and alliances that determined who spoke to whom and for how long. It was during her observation of these protocols that she first became aware of Lord Greystone's presence. He entered the principal drawing room with the kind of understated confidence that marked those born to consequence. Yet there was something in his bearing that suggested hard-won wisdom rather than inherited arrogance. Tall and lean, with dark hair that showed premature threads of silver at the temples, he possessed the kind of masculine beauty that drew eyes without appearing to court attention. His evening dress was impeccable without being ostentatious, and the way other gentlemen stepped aside to acknowledge his passage spoke to a natural authority that transcended mere social precedence. What struck Evangeline most forcibly was the expression of weary intelligence in his gray eyes as they surveyed the assembled company. There was a world weariness there that spoke of experiences that had cost him dearly, and for one fleeting instant, when his gaze fell upon a particularly ostentatious display of flirtation between a married lady and her cavalier, a shadow of hardened cynicism crossed his features. A darkness he swiftly banished, as though dismissing an unwelcome specter from his past. Here was a man who had seen through the pretenses and hypocrisies of fashionable society, yet who moved within its constraints with the ease of long practice, carrying with him the invisible scars of one who had once participated in those very follies he now observed with such detached understanding. When Lady Pemberton performed the introductions that Lady Margaret had worked so assiduously to secure, Lord Greystone's manner toward Helena was perfectly correct, yet somehow distant, as though he were performing a role whose dialogue he knew by heart. The conversation that followed unfolded precisely as such encounters were designed to unfold. Inquiries about the season's entertainments, observations about mutual acquaintances, compliments delivered with practiced gallantry. Helena played her part with considerable skill, having been thoroughly coached in the art of appearing accomplished without seeming blue-stocking, interested without being forward, and charming without descending to vulgarity. Yet even from her distant position, Evangeline could discern that Lord Greystone's attention was not truly engaged, that he was going through the motions of courtship like an actor performing a play he had grown tired of presenting. It was during this exchange that disaster struck in the form of a carelessly placed Persian rug and an over-eager footman bearing a tray of champagne glasses. Helena, gesturing with particular enthusiasm while describing her accomplishments upon the pianoforte, stepped backward directly into the servant's path. The collision that followed sent crystal flying and champagne cascading in a golden arc that decorated both Helena's emerald silk and the Turkish carpet beneath her feet. The mortification that seized Helena was so profound that she seemed momentarily paralyzed, her face cycling through shades of pink and white that clashed unfortunately with her ruined gown. Lady Margaret appeared at her daughter's side with the speed of a hawk diving upon prey, her expression promising retribution for the servant whose clumsiness had endangered months of careful planning. It was Lord Greystone himself who took command of the situation, his voice cutting through the gathering murmurs of concern and speculation with quiet authority. Without appearing to hurry or fuss, he guided Helena toward a quieter alcove where the damage might be assessed and remediated. Lady Margaret followed, directing increasingly frantic gestures toward Evangeline, who understood immediately that her services would be required. She approached the group with the careful balance of haste and dignity that her position demanded, her reticule already opened to reveal the small sewing kit she always carried for such emergencies. What followed was a delicate operation conducted under the watchful eyes of half the ton. Evangeline knelt beside Helena's chair, her fingers working with swift precision to assess what might be salvaged and what must be concealed. The champagne had created several stains across the silk skirt, but more damaging was a tear where Helena's heel had caught the fabric during her precipitous retreat from the collision. The damage was extensive enough to require immediate attention, yet not so severe as to necessitate a complete withdrawal from the evening's entertainment. As Evangeline worked, she became increasingly aware of Lord Greystone's presence beside her chair. Where she might have expected impatience or dismissal, she found instead an attention that seemed peculiarly focused. When she risked a glance upward, she discovered gray eyes studying her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. There was something in that gaze that seemed to see beyond the modest gray silk and careful deference to the woman beneath, a recognition that made her pulse quicken in ways both thrilling and terrifying. Her needle moved with practiced efficiency, creating invisible repairs that would hold for the remainder of the evening while arranging the drape of the skirt to minimize the appearance of the remaining stains. It was work that required concentration and skill, yet she found herself distracted by the increasing certainty that Lord Greystone was studying not merely her handiwork, but herself with an attention that seemed to strip away all her carefully constructed defenses. When at last she rose from her task, declaring Helena fit to rejoin the company, she expected dismissal and a return to her position against the wall. Instead, Lord Greystone stepped forward with a slight bow that seemed to encompass both ladies, but somehow focused most particularly upon herself. His voice, when he spoke, carried the kind of cultivated warmth that marked the practiced courtier. Yet beneath its surface, she detected something that seemed more genuine than the mere performance of social duty. He complimented her skill with needle and thread in terms that managed to be appreciative without being condescending, noting that such accomplishments spoke well of her character and education. The words were conventional enough, yet something in their delivery suggested meanings that went beyond mere politeness. Helena, restored to confidence by the successful repair of her costume, reclaimed Lord Greystone's attention with renewed determination. Yet throughout the conversation that followed, Evangeline found his gaze returning to her with a frequency that made her increasingly uncomfortable. She was accustomed to invisibility, to serving her function without attracting notice or comment. This sudden visibility felt dangerous, laden with possibilities that her position forbade her even to contemplate. As the evening progressed and the dancing began in the adjoining ballroom, Evangeline observed Lord Greystone's interactions with the other ladies present with the attention of a scholar studying a particularly complex text. He danced with Helena twice, the maximum permitted by the strict protocols of polite society, and fulfilled his social obligations with several other partners. Yet even while performing the elaborate figures of the country dances, his eyes seemed to seek her out with a persistence that made her heart race and her hands tremble as she attempted to occupy herself with needlework in the corner reserved for chaperones and companions. The evening's climax came during the second waltz, when custom demanded that Lord Greystone select a partner from among the available ladies. Helena positioned herself with strategic precision, her fan deployed in the complex semaphore that communicated availability and interest to experienced practitioners of the art of flirtation. Lady Margaret hovered nearby, radiating maternal approval and anticipation. Yet when Lord Greystone moved across the floor, his destination proved to be not Helena's chair, but the corner where Evangeline sat with her embroidery, her gray silk making her nearly invisible among the shadows. The request, when it came, was delivered with such quiet dignity that it seemed to transform the very air around them. He asked if she would honor him with a dance in terms that would have been appropriate for addressing a duchess, his gray eyes holding hers with an intensity that made the rest of the ballroom seem to fade into insignificance. The invitation hung in the air like a challenge to every convention that governed her existence, an offer of transformation that seemed to promise wonders beyond her most secret dreams. Yet even as every nerve in her body urged acceptance, Evangeline's hard-won wisdom whispered warnings about the dangers of such attention. She was acutely aware of Lady Margaret's expression of shock and displeasure, of Helena's stricken countenance, of the dozen pairs of eyes that had turned to witness this unprecedented breach of social protocol. Her position, precarious at best, could not survive such a public acknowledgement of inappropriate elevation. Her refusal, when it came, was delivered with the same quiet dignity that had marked his invitation. She thanked Lord Greystone for the honor with perfect correctness, while explaining that her duties as companion prevented her from participating in the evening's dancing. The words were conventional enough, yet she hoped he might detect in them some hint of the regret that made her voice tremble despite her best efforts at composure. What followed was a moment of perfect silence that seemed to stretch into eternity. Lord Greystone's gray eyes held hers with an expression that seemed to acknowledge both her refusal and the reasons that necessitated it. Then, with a bow that somehow managed to convey both acceptance and promise, he turned away to select another partner from among the ladies who awaited his attention. Yet as Evangeline watched him lead Miss Thornberry into the figures of the waltz, she could not escape the certainty that something fundamental had shifted in the carefully ordered universe of her existence. The look that had passed between them carried implications that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure, suggesting possibilities that her circumstances forbade, yet her heart refused to dismiss entirely. The fortnight that followed Lady Pemberton's soirée brought with it a peculiar alteration in the rhythm of life at Brook Street. Lady Margaret's disappointment over Helena's failure to secure Lord Greystone's particular attention had manifested in a series of increasingly elaborate schemes designed to remedy this perceived oversight. Invitations were pursued with the tenacity of a military campaign. Morning calls were orchestrated with the precision of diplomatic negotiations, and Helena's wardrobe was subjected to constant revision in the pursuit of some combination of colors and fabrics that might prove irresistible to discerning masculine taste. For Evangeline, these machinations brought an unwelcome increase in visibility and responsibility. Lady Margaret had somehow convinced herself that the evening's disappointments stemmed from inadequate preparation rather than lack of genuine connection, and she had determined that Evangeline's evident skill with needle and thread, combined with her observations of Ton behavior, might prove useful in future campaigns. The result was a series of conferences in which Evangeline found herself consulted about everything from the proper depth of curtsy for addressing a viscount to the most flattering arrangement of Helena's auburn curls. These discussions were torture for one who had spent years perfecting the art of invisibility. Each question forced her to reveal knowledge that spoke of breeding and education far beyond what her position should have provided, while each suggestion she offered risked further elevation of expectations she could never hope to fulfill. Yet refusal to participate would have been seen as sullen ingratitude, a luxury her circumstances could not afford. The situation grew more complicated with the arrival of Lord Greystone's calling card on a silver salver one Tuesday morning. The pasteboard rectangle, elegantly engraved with his name and title, represented exactly the kind of acknowledgement that Lady Margaret had been pursuing with such determination. Yet the timing of its arrival, precisely during the hours designated for morning calls, suggested that his lordship intended to present himself in person rather than merely fulfilling the social obligation of leaving his card. Lady Margaret's reaction to this development bordered upon hysteria. Helena was hustled upstairs for emergency consultation with her Abigail about her appearance, while Cordelia and Isabella were pressed into service to ensure that the drawing room presented the proper impression of elegant domesticity. Sir Reginald, summoned from his study, pronounced himself satisfied with these developments and retired to his club with the air of a general who had successfully concluded a difficult siege. Evangeline found herself assigned the contradictory roles of ensuring that every detail of the household's preparation met the highest standards while maintaining the invisibility that her position demanded. She supervised the arrangement of flowers, consulted on the selection of refreshments, and made subtle adjustments to Helena's coiffure that would enhance her natural advantages without appearing to represent undue effort. Yet all these activities were conducted with the growing certainty that Lord Greystone's visit represented something more complex than a simple fulfillment of social obligation. When his lordship arrived at precisely 3 o'clock, his appearance confirmed her suspicions that this was no ordinary morning call. He entered the drawing room with the easy confidence that marked those born to command attention. Yet there was something in his manner that suggested particular purpose rather than mere social duty. His greeting to Lady Margaret was perfectly correct, his acknowledgement of Helena appropriately gallant, yet Evangeline detected in his grey eyes a quality of watchful assessment that seemed to encompass the entire household, with particular attention to details that others might overlook. The conversation that followed unfolded according to the established protocols for such encounters, yet beneath its conventional surface, undercurrents of meaning flowed that transformed routine exchanges into something approaching strategic maneuvering. Lord Greystone inquired about Helena's health with proper solicitude, complimented the household's taste in furnishing with appropriate appreciation, and expressed interest in the family's plans for the remainder of the season with becoming attention to their comfort and entertainment. Yet throughout these exchanges, Evangeline found herself the subject of glances that seemed to carry weight disproportionate to her position in the room. When Lady Margaret mentioned her services as companion and instructor to the younger daughters, Lord Greystone's attention sharpened in ways that made her increasingly uncomfortable. His questions about her background and qualifications were perfectly proper, yet delivered with an intensity that suggested meanings beyond mere polite interest. The crisis came when Helena, eager to demonstrate her accomplishments, suggested that Evangeline might be prevailed upon to display her skill upon the pianoforte. The instrument in question was a magnificent Broadwood that Sir Reginald had purchased at considerable expense, reasoning that no proper drawing room could be considered complete without such an ornament. Helena's own performances upon it were competent but uninspired, lacking the natural musicality that could not be purchased along with expensive instruction. Evangeline's protests that such display would be inappropriate for one in her position were overruled by Lady Margaret's determination to present every possible evidence of the household's refinement. She found herself seated at the keyboard with Lord Greystone positioned where he could observe both her technique and her expression, his grey eyes fixed upon her with an attention that made her fingers tremble as they found their places upon the keys. She had chosen a piece by Mozart, technically demanding yet sufficiently restrained to avoid the appearance of showing off. Yet as her fingers moved through the familiar patterns, something within her rebelled against the constraints that governed every other aspect of her existence. The music that emerged was not the careful, controlled performance that her position demanded, but something far more personal, an expression of longing and intelligence and carefully suppressed passion that transformed the elegant drawing room into a space where souls might speak to one another without the mediation of social convention. When the final notes died away, the silence that followed was profound enough to make her acutely aware of every heartbeat, every breath, every slight rustle of silk that marked the listener's return to ordinary consciousness. Helena's expression combined admiration with something approaching resentment, while Lady Margaret's face reflected calculations about how such talent might be deployed to advance the family's interests. Yet it was Lord Greystone's reaction that mattered most, and his grey eyes held an expression of recognition that seemed to strip away every careful pretense she had constructed about her background and breeding. His compliments, when they came, were delivered with a warmth that went beyond mere politeness. He spoke of her technique with the knowledge of one who understood music as more than mere accomplishment, praising not only her skill, but the intelligence and sensitivity that informed her interpretation. The words were conventional enough to pass Lady Margaret's scrutiny, yet their delivery carried implications that made Evangeline's pulse quicken with a mixture of pleasure and alarm. The remainder of the visit passed in a blur of conventional pleasantries, yet Evangeline remained acutely aware of Lord Greystone's continued attention. When he rose to take his leave, his farewell to herself was accompanied by a slight bow that seemed to carry more weight than mere courtesy, and his parting words included a hope that he might have the pleasure of hearing her play again in the near future. The days that followed brought a succession of similar encounters, as Lord Greystone began appearing with increasing frequency in the places where the Fortescue family might be found. He attended the same assemblies, appeared at the same lending libraries, and seemed to develop a sudden interest in morning rides through Hyde Park at precisely the hours when Helena had been instructed to display herself to advantage. Yet for all Lady Margaret's satisfaction at these developments, Evangeline could not escape the suspicion that his lordship's true object was not Helena, but herself. The evidence accumulated with each passing encounter. At Mrs. Thornberry's musical evening, he positioned himself where he could observe Evangeline's reactions to the various performances, rather than focusing his attention upon Helena's animated commentary. During a chance meeting at Hatchard's, he engaged her in discussion about the book she was examining, a volume of poetry by Wordsworth, with a knowledge and appreciation that spoke of genuine literary taste rather than mere social accomplishment. Most telling of all was the morning when she encountered him alone during her solitary walk through the quieter paths of Hyde Park. The meeting appeared accidental, yet something in his manner suggested it had been deliberately orchestrated. He fell into step beside her, with the easy familiarity of an old friend, engaging her in conversation that ranged from observations about the changing season to discussions of literature and philosophy that revealed the breadth of his education and the sophistication of his intellect. For 40 minutes, they walked and talked as equals, their conversation flowing with the natural ease that marked genuine compatibility of minds and temperaments. He spoke of his travels on the continent with dry humor that revealed both his cosmopolitan experience and his fundamentally English sensibilities, while she found herself responding with an openness that 3 years of careful guardedness had not entirely suppressed. It was only when they approached the more fashionable areas of the park, where discovery might prove disastrous to her carefully maintained position, that the spell was broken and reality reasserted its claims. Her withdrawal from the conversation was swift and complete, her manner resuming the deferential correctness that her situation demanded. Yet as they parted, he to rejoin the fashionable throng of riders and drivers, she to return to her employer's house, the look that passed between them carried acknowledgement of what had transpired and promise of what might yet unfold. That evening, as she sat in her small chamber reviewing the day's events, Evangeline found herself confronting truths that her position made it dangerous to acknowledge. Lord Greystone's interest in her was neither imaginary nor casual. It was real, growing, and potentially catastrophic to every arrangement that governed her existence. Yet despite every rational argument her mind could muster, her heart refused to be silent about the possibilities that such interest might represent. The battle between prudence and hope that raged within her breast would, she suspected, determine not only her own future, but the fate of everyone whose lives had become entangled with her own. For she was beginning to understand that Lord Greystone possessed the power to transform not merely her circumstances, but her very conception of what her life might become. And such transformation, once begun, would prove impossible to contain or control. That night, alone in her chamber, with only candlelight for company, the echo of his voice from their morning encounter seemed to linger in the silence around her. It was not merely the promise of a different future that left her sleepless. It was the terrifying and exhilarating realization that the walls of her carefully constructed world were no longer fixed boundaries, but barriers that might be overcome. He had not offered her escape from her circumstances. He had shown her that she herself possessed the strength to transform them entirely. The invitation to Greymont Park arrived on a morning when autumn had begun its earnest assault upon the London plane trees, their leaves turning to gold and bronze in the crisp October air. Lady Margaret received the elegant missive with the triumphant satisfaction of a general who has successfully breached an enemy's most formidable fortification. Lord Greystone, it seemed, had extended an invitation for the Fortescue family to spend a fortnight at his ancestral estate in Derbyshire, an acknowledgement of serious intentions that sent ripples of excitement and calculation through the household on Brook Street. The invitation itself was a masterpiece of diplomatic courtesy, expressing his lordship's desire to reciprocate the family's hospitality while offering the pleasures of country air and sport to those who might find such diversions agreeable. Yet beneath its conventional phrases, Evangeline detected nuances that suggested layers of meaning invisible to less experienced observers. The timing of the invitation, after the close of the London season but before the onset of winter weather, spoke to careful planning rather than casual impulse. More significantly, the specific inclusion of companions and attendants in the invitation's scope suggested an attention to household details that went beyond mere formality. Lady Margaret's response to these developments bordered upon the apoplectic. Helena's wardrobe required immediate expansion to accommodate country entertainments while maintaining the elegance appropriate to a Viscountess's establishment. Cordelia and Isabella were subjected to intensive coaching in the protocols governing visits to grand houses, while Sir Reginald was dispatched to his tailor for consultation about appropriate attire for country sporting activities he had no intention of pursuing with any enthusiasm. For Evangeline, the prospect of such a journey presented complications that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. Her position as companion to the younger daughters would require her presence during the visit. Yet the intimacy inherent in house party entertainment would make her usual strategies of invisibility far more difficult to maintain. Worse still was the growing certainty that Lord Greystone's invitation had been extended with her presence specifically in mind, a possibility that both thrilled and terrified her in equal measure. The journey to Derbyshire unfolded over 3 days of increasingly spectacular countryside, as the flat expanses around London gave way to the rolling hills and dramatic peaks that marked the approach to Lord Greystone's ancestral domain. Evangeline found herself pressed into service as intermediary between the family's excitement and their anxiety, soothing Helena's concerns about her appearance while managing Isabella's romantic expectations about castle life and countryside adventure. Greymont Park, when it finally appeared through the carriage windows, exceeded even Isabella's most fevered imaginings. The house rose from its landscaped grounds like something from a fairy tale, its grey stone walls and mullioned windows speaking of centuries of noble occupation, while its elegant proportions suggested more recent improvements calculated to enhance both comfort and beauty. The approach drive wound through parkland that had been shaped by Capability Brown himself, creating vistas that seemed designed to inspire awe in visitors while proclaiming the taste and resources of their host. Lord Greystone awaited their arrival in the Great Hall, surrounded by an establishment that managed to suggest both ancient dignity and modern efficiency. His greeting to the family was everything that courtesy required, yet Evangeline could not escape the impression that his grey eyes lingered upon herself with particular warmth when he welcomed her to his home. The attention lasted only moments, yet it was sufficient to send color flooding to her cheeks and to make her acutely aware of Isabella's speculative glances. The apartments assigned to the family reflected careful consideration of their comfort and consequence. Helena and her parents were housed in the principal guest wing, their chambers overlooking the formal gardens and commanding views of the deer park beyond. Cordelia and Isabella shared an elegant suite that had been furnished with particular attention to the needs of young ladies, complete with a sitting room where they might pursue their correspondence and accomplishments in comfortable privacy. Evangeline's accommodation presented a more complex challenge. Too elevated in education and breeding to lodge with the servants, yet too humble in official position to rank with family members, she found herself assigned to a charming chamber in what had once been the chaplain's quarters. The room was smaller than those occupied by the Fortescues, yet its furnishings spoke of consideration and taste. A writing desk positioned to catch the morning light suggested that its occupant was expected to have literary pursuits, while the presence of a well-stocked bookshelf implied interests that went beyond mere decoration. The first days of the visit unfolded according to the established rhythms of country house entertainment. Lord Greystone proved himself an accomplished host, providing diversions calculated to appeal to his various guests while maintaining the delicate balance between attention and independence that marked the experienced aristocrat. Helena was partnered for morning rides through the estate, her equestrian skills having been carefully cultivated for just such opportunities. The younger daughters were encouraged to explore the house's extensive library and picture gallery, while Lady Margaret was provided with access to the estate's famous gardens and the company of neighboring gentlewomen whose conversation might prove both entertaining and instructive. Yet beneath these conventional entertainments, Evangeline detected undercurrents of purpose that suggested her host's true intentions lay elsewhere. His attention to the family's comfort was exemplary, yet she could not escape the awareness that his gray eyes sought her out with increasing frequency as the days progressed. During evening entertainments in the drawing room, when Helena displayed her accomplishments upon the pianoforte or engaged in the kind of animated conversation calculated to demonstrate her social graces, Lord Greystone's attention seemed divided between politeness to his designated object and a fascination with the quiet companion who sat in the shadows, occupied with needlework or a book. The crisis came on the 5th evening of their visit, during what had been planned as a simple musical entertainment following dinner. Helena had prepared a selection of pieces calculated to showcase her technical proficiency while maintaining the kind of modest demeanor that was thought to appeal to masculine sensibilities. Yet when she rose from the keyboard, after delivering a competent but uninspired performance of a sonata by Clementi, Lord Greystone's attention turned immediately to Evangeline, with a request that she might honor the company with her own musical contributions. The invitation was delivered with such quiet authority that refusal seemed impossible, yet Evangeline understood instinctively that compliance would represent a crossing of boundaries from which there could be no retreat. To display her superior accomplishments before Helena and her family would be to acknowledge openly the pretenses that governed their relationship, while to demonstrate the depth of her education and breeding would invite questions about her background that she was not prepared to answer. Yet as she seated herself at the magnificent instrument, a Broadwood grand that Lord Greystone had informed them had been installed at considerable expense, something within her rebelled against the constraints that had governed every other aspect of their relationship. Her fingers found the opening notes of a piece by Bach, complex and beautiful and demanding of both technical skill and interpretive sensitivity. As the music unfolded, she felt the peculiar liberation that came from setting aside pretense in favor of authentic expression. The performance that followed was unlike anything she had previously allowed herself in company. Gone was the careful restraint that her position demanded, replaced by a passionate engagement with the music that revealed layers of intelligence and sensibility she had spent years concealing. The Bach gave way to Mozart, then to Beethoven, each piece chosen not for its appropriateness to her supposed station, but for its ability to express the complex emotions that her circumstances had forced her to suppress. When at last the music ended, the silence that followed was profound enough to make her suddenly aware of the magnitude of what she had revealed. Helena's face reflected a mixture of admiration and resentment, while Lady Margaret's expression suggested calculations about how such talent might be explained to those who might inquire about its origins. Yet it was Lord Greystone's reaction that mattered most, and when she finally raised her eyes to meet his gaze, she found there an expression of recognition and understanding that seemed to strip away every careful pretense she had constructed about her identity. What followed was a conversation that began with conventional compliments about her musical accomplishments, but gradually expanded to encompass topics that revealed the breadth of their mutual interests and the compatibility of their intellectual sympathies. Lord Greystone spoke of his travels through Europe with particular attention to the musical traditions he had encountered, while Evangeline found herself responding with observations that drew upon reading far more extensive than any companion should have possessed. The evening concluded with all the conventional pleasantries that courtesy required, yet as Evangeline made her way to her chamber, she carried with her the certainty that fundamental barriers had been breached in ways that could not be undone. Lord Greystone had seen through her carefully maintained disguise to the woman beneath, while she had glimpsed in him qualities of mind and character that went far beyond the mere requirements of rank and fortune. Her last conscious thought before sleep claimed her was the recognition that she stood upon the threshold of discoveries that would transform not only her understanding of her own possibilities, but her conception of what love might mean when it flowered between souls that recognized each other across all the artificial barriers that society might erect to keep them apart. The following morning brought an unexpected delivery that would cast long shadows over the days to come. Among the usual correspondence was a letter bearing an unfamiliar legal seal, addressed to her in a careful hand she did not recognize. The sender identified himself as Mr. Tobias Whitfield, a solicitor from London whose name meant nothing to her, yet whose very existence seemed to carry implications she could not fathom. The letter's formal language spoke of matters requiring her attention, yet something in its phrasing made her reluctant to pursue its contents immediately. Disturbed by possibilities she could not name, she placed the correspondence in her writing desk, postponing whatever anxieties its full revelation might bring. There would be time enough for such concerns when her heart was less occupied with more immediate uncertainties. The morning of October the 22nd dawned gray and forbidding, with clouds that seemed to press down upon the Derbyshire hills like a weight of impending sorrow. Evangeline woke with a sense of uneasiness that she could not entirely attribute to the weather, though the heavy atmosphere seemed to mirror the gathering tensions that had been building throughout their visit to Greymont Park. The household had fallen into routines that appeared tranquil on the surface, yet carried undercurrents of expectation that made every interaction seem fraught with significance. Lord Greystone's behavior toward her during the preceding days had grown increasingly difficult to characterize as mere courtesy. His attention sought her out during morning walks through the estate gardens, where he would join her seemingly by accident, yet with a frequency that suggested careful planning. Their conversations during these encounters had ranged far beyond the safe territories of weather and local scenery to encompass literature, philosophy, and observations about human nature that revealed the depth of their intellectual compatibility. More troubling still were the moments when she would discover his gray eyes fixed upon her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. During evening entertainments in the drawing room, while Helena performed upon the pianoforte or engaged other guests in animated conversation, his attention would drift to where Evangeline sat with her needlework, and the expression she found there spoke of recognition and longing that terrified her with their implications. The crisis that would transform all their careful pretenses began with the arrival of an unexpected visitor. Evangeline was arranging flowers in the morning room when the sound of carriage wheels upon gravel announced an arrival that had not been anticipated by the household. Through the mullioned windows, she observed a traveling chaise of obvious expense and elegance, its occupant hidden behind curtains that suggested either invalidity or a desire for privacy that went beyond mere preference. Lord Greystone received his unexpected guest in the library, their conference lasting nearly 2 hours while the household speculated about the identity of this mysterious visitor and the urgency that had brought them to Greymont Park without advance notice. When at last the library doors opened to reveal both men emerging into the great hall, Evangeline caught her first glimpse of a gentleman whose appearance seemed to combine advanced age with an alertness that suggested formidable intelligence despite his obvious frailty. The introductions that followed were conducted with careful attention to precedence and protocol, yet beneath their conventional surface ran undercurrents of significance that she could not entirely decipher. The visitor was identified as Mr. Tobias Whitfield, a gentleman whose modest title concealed what was apparently considerable importance in Lord Greystone's affairs. His manner toward the assembled family was courteous, yet somewhat distracted, as though his attention was focused upon matters of greater consequence than mere social pleasantries. It was during the general conversation that followed these introductions that disaster struck with the swiftness of a summer storm. Mr. Whitfield, his pale eyes fixed upon Evangeline with an intensity that made her increasingly uncomfortable, suddenly interrupted Helena's description of London entertainments with a question that seemed to emerge from nowhere and nowhere to go. His inquiry concerned her parentage, delivered with the kind of casual directness that suggested he possessed information that others lacked. When she stammered some conventional response about being connected to Sir Reginald's family through her late mother, Mr. Whitfield's expression sharpened with satisfaction that sent chills of apprehension down her spine. His next question concerned her mother's maiden name, a detail that Evangeline had spent 3 years avoiding through careful misdirection and changes of subject. The trap, when it closed, did so with the efficiency of a mechanism that had been carefully constructed over many years. Mr. Whitfield's revelation that he had served as solicitor to one Margaret Beaumont until her death some 4 years previous transformed the morning room's comfortable atmosphere into something approaching a court of inquiry. His subsequent disclosure that Miss Margaret Beaumont had been the natural daughter of the late Earl of Drayton, acknowledged though not legitimized, sent shockwaves through the assembled company that seemed to alter the very air they breathed. What followed was a recitation of facts that demolished every careful fiction that had governed Evangeline's existence since her arrival at Brook Street. Her mother, it emerged, had been not merely the Earl's natural daughter, but his acknowledged favorite, provided with an education befitting her birth and a settlement that had enabled her to live independently, though not openly, in society. Her marriage to Captain Beaumont, a younger son of impeccable family though modest fortune, had been a love match that had unfortunately proved brief due to his death in service to the Crown in India. Margaret Beaumont's subsequent years had been spent in genteel retirement in Bath, where she had devoted herself to her daughter's education while carefully managing the inheritance that her father's affection had provided. Her death from influenza 4 years previous had left Evangeline with resources that, while not enormous, were sufficient to ensure her independence had she chosen to claim them. The complexity lay in the conditions attached to this inheritance, which required acknowledgement of her true parentage and acceptance of the irregular circumstances of her birth. Mr. Whitfield's explanation of these circumstances was delivered with the dry precision of one accustomed to dealing with the complications that arose from aristocratic irregularities. The Earl of Drayton, he revealed, had been both generous and far-sighted in his provisions for his natural children. Margaret's settlement had been carefully structured to provide not only for her lifetime but for her descendants, with particular attention to ensuring that any grandchildren might eventually take their proper place in society, despite the circumstances of their birth. The revelation that Evangeline possessed not only gentle birth, but also independence sufficient to ensure her comfort sent ripples of shock through the assembled company that manifested in different ways according to their various characters. Lady Margaret's expression cycled through calculations that seemed to reconfigure every assumption she had made about her companion's circumstances, while Helena's face reflected the dawning understanding that her supposed inferior had been playing a role far more sophisticated than any of them had suspected. Yet it was Lord Greystone's reaction that mattered most to Evangeline's racing heart. His grey eyes had fixed upon her with an expression that seemed to combine relief with something approaching admiration, as though her revealed circumstances had resolved questions that had long puzzled him about the incongruities between her position and her obvious breeding. When he spoke, his words were addressed to Mr. Whitfield, yet seemed intended primarily for her own ears, expressing satisfaction that justice had finally been served and that merit had been allowed to find its proper recognition. The legal formalities that followed seemed to pass in a blur of documents and explanations that transformed her understanding of her own possibilities with bewildering rapidity. The inheritance that Mr. Whitfield laid before her was not vast by the standards of great estates, yet it was more than sufficient to ensure her independence and respectability. More importantly, the careful provisions made by her grandfather demonstrated an attention to her future welfare that spoke of affection transcending the irregularities of her birth. Yet even as these revelations opened vistas of possibility that had previously been unimaginable, they also created complications that seemed to multiply with each passing moment. Her position with the Fortescue family had been built upon foundations that no longer existed, while her growing attachment to Lord Greystone was complicated by questions of motive that her new circumstances made impossible to ignore. It was during an afternoon walk through the estate's quieter paths that Providence provided her with unexpected insight into his lordship's character. She had taken refuge in a small copse that overlooked the home farm when the sound of voices drew her attention to a conference taking place near the estate office. Lord Greystone stood with his steward, Mr. Richardson, examining what appeared to be surveyor's maps while engaging in animated discussion with a gentleman whose expensive dress and calculating manner marked him as a representative of commercial interests. The conversation that followed, clearly audible in the still afternoon air, revealed Lord Greystone rejecting an offer that would have resolved his financial difficulties at a stroke. The gentleman, a mill owner from Manchester, had proposed purchasing a tract of ancient woodland that commanded an excellent price for its timber and potential conversion to industrial use. Yet Lord Greystone's refusal was absolute, delivered with quiet authority that brooked no negotiation. His reasoning, as he explained to the increasingly frustrated businessman, centered not upon sentiment but upon principle. The woodland in question had provided his tenants with ancient rights of pannage and fuel gathering for generations, while its streams supplied water to several cottage gardens that helped sustain families through the leaner months. To sacrifice such long-standing obligations for mere financial expedience would represent a betrayal of the trust that bound landlord to tenant in bonds more sacred than legal contract. The businessman's departure, accompanied by muttered observations about aristocratic folly and missed opportunities, left Lord Greystone and his steward to contemplate maps that represented obligations rather than opportunities. Their discussion of alternative economies, agricultural improvements that might increase yields, innovations in estate management that could reduce costs, revealed a man committed to honorable stewardship despite its financial inconvenience. Evangeline withdrew from her inadvertent observation with understanding that transformed her entire conception of his character and circumstances. Here was evidence of integrity that transcended mere social performance, proof of principles that would sacrifice personal advantage for moral obligation. Yet the very nobility of his actions made her own situation more complex. For if his regard for her was genuine rather than calculated, then her doubts about his motivations became cruel rather than prudent. The remainder of the day passed in a series of private conferences and difficult conversations as the implications of her changed circumstances rippled through all the relationships that had previously defined her world. Lady Margaret's reaction combined wounded pride with calculating speculation about how Evangeline's new status might be turned to the family's advantage, while Helena struggled to adjust her conception of their relationship in light of revelations that transformed her companion into something approaching an equal. Yet it was Isabella's response that provided the only moment of unalloyed comfort in that day of bewildering revelations. That evening, a soft knock came at Evangeline's chamber door, revealing the youngest Fortescue daughter, whose eyes glistened not with envy or calculation, but with genuine, unguarded joy. Without her mother's carefully chosen words or her sister's forced attempts at adjustment, Isabella simply took Evangeline's hands in her own and whispered her gratitude, not for the kindnesses of a companion, but for the friendship of a sister. It was the sole reaction within the household that warmed Evangeline's heart without reservation, a reminder that genuine affection could transcend the artificial boundaries that circumstances might create. Most difficult of all was the conversation with Lord Greystone that took place that evening in the library, where the flickering firelight seemed to underscore the momentous nature of the subjects they addressed. His manner toward her had undergone a subtle transformation that acknowledged her changed circumstances while maintaining the careful respect that had always marked their interactions. Yet beneath his courtesy, she detected something that seemed to approach relief, as though her revealed status had removed barriers that had previously made honest communication impossible. When he spoke of his growing regard for her, his words carried weight that had been previously concealed beneath layers of social propriety. The attachment that had developed between them during their time at Greymont Park could now be acknowledged openly, no longer constrained by the impossible gulf between Viscount and companion that had previously rendered such feelings both hopeless and inappropriate. Yet even as her heart soared at these acknowledgments, Evangeline could not escape the troubling suspicion that Lord Greystone's relief might stem from motivations that went beyond mere social propriety. His financial difficulties were well known throughout the ton, and her inheritance, while modest by great estate standards, represented precisely the kind of settlement that might resolve his most pressing obligations without requiring him to sacrifice his pride through a purely mercenary alliance. The possibility that his regard for her might be influenced by her changed circumstances cast a shadow over revelations that should have brought nothing but joy. As she retired to her chamber that evening, Evangeline found herself confronting questions about love and interest that would determine not only her own future, but the fate of hearts that had become entangled in ways both wonderful and potentially devastating. The days that followed Mr. Whitfield's revelations passed with the peculiar quality of a dream that hovers between wonder and nightmare, where each moment of joy carries within it the seeds of equally profound sorrow. Evangeline's changed circumstances had transformed every relationship within the household at Greymont Park. Yet the alterations were not always improvements upon what had existed before. Lady Margaret's newfound deference carried undertones of resentment that made every interaction a careful negotiation of wounded pride and altered expectations, while Helena's attempts at sisterly equality seemed forced and artificial after 3 years of casual cruelty disguised as benevolent condescension. Most complex of all was the transformation in Lord Greystone's manner toward her. The careful distance that had previously marked their interactions had given way to an attention that was both more open and somehow more guarded, as though her revealed status had removed certain barriers while erecting others in their place. His invitations to walk with him through the estate grounds were now issued with the forthright courtesy appropriate to a lady of independent means. Yet she could not escape the suspicion that his relief at her changed circumstances might spring from considerations that went beyond mere social propriety. The question that tormented her during sleepless nights was whether Lord Greystone's growing attentions represented genuine affection for her person or merely satisfaction at discovering that his interest in her need not conflict with his financial necessities. Her inheritance, while not enormous by the standards of great fortunes, represented precisely the kind of settlement that might resolve his most pressing obligations without requiring the complete sacrifice of personal inclination that a purely mercenary marriage would demand. These doubts were given painful substance during a conversation she inadvertently overheard between Lord Greystone and his steward, Mr. Richardson. The two men had been conferring in the estate office when business called Richardson away momentarily, leaving Lord Greystone alone with correspondence that had arrived in the Morning Post. Evangeline, passing the partially open door on her way to the library, could not help but notice the expression of profound relief that crossed his features as he examined what appeared to be documents related to the estate's financial obligations. When Richardson returned, their discussion resumed with references to mortgage payments and loan extensions that painted a picture of financial pressure far more severe than she had previously understood. Lord Greystone's comments about recent developments that might alleviate these difficulties were delivered with satisfaction that seemed to encompass more than mere abstract pleasure at improved circumstances. The timing of his optimism, coinciding so precisely with revelations about her inheritance, created implications that she found increasingly difficult to dismiss. Yet even as these suspicions tormented her, she could not deny the evidence of her own observations regarding Lord Greystone's behavior. His attention to her comfort and happiness seemed genuine rather than calculated, while his manner during their private conversations carried warmth that appeared to transcend mere courtesy or strategic interest. The intellectual compatibility that had drawn them together remained as compelling as ever, creating moments of perfect understanding that seemed to transcend considerations of fortune or social advantage. The crisis that would force resolution of these competing possibilities arrived in the form of a letter bearing the seal of the Earl of Pembroke, whose eldest son had been among the most persistent of Helena's suitors during the London season. The correspondence, addressed to Sir Reginald but shared with obvious satisfaction among the female members of the family, contained a formal offer for Helena's hand that represented the culmination of Lady Margaret's most ambitious matrimonial schemes. Lord Pembroke's son possessed youth, title, and fortune in combinations that made him an entirely suitable match for a baron's daughter, regardless of the commercial origins of her family's wealth. More significantly for the present circumstances, his interest in Helena appeared to be based upon genuine admiration for her person, rather than calculated assessment of her dowry. suggesting that affection might flower into something approaching the romantic ideals that had been sadly absent from most aristocratic marriages of their acquaintance. Helena's reaction to this development was everything that her parents might have desired. She had formed a decided preference for the young man during their London encounters, and the prospect of becoming a countess appeared to reconcile any lingering disappointment about Lord Greystone's failure to offer for her. Her immediate acceptance of the proposal created an atmosphere of celebration throughout the household that should have brought Evangeline nothing but happiness for her former tormentor's good fortune. Yet the announcement of Helena's engagement created complications for her own situation that she had not fully anticipated. With Helena's future secured, the Fortescue family's attention turned naturally toward the extraordinary transformation in their former companion's circumstances. Lady Margaret's suggestions about Evangeline's future plans were delivered with barely concealed impatience to see her established elsewhere, while Sir Reginald's hints about the impropriety of unmarried ladies living independently carried implications that made her increasingly uncomfortable. The pressure to resolve her own matrimonial future was intensified by observations about Lord Greystone's continued attentions that were delivered with the kind of meaningful looks and loaded silences that made subtlety impossible to maintain. Lady Margaret's comments about the convenience of alliances that might benefit both parties were particularly pointed, creating an atmosphere in which every private conversation with his lordship became a subject for speculation and commentary. It was during one such conversation, conducted in the relative privacy of the estate's formal garden, that Lord Greystone finally addressed the question that had been hovering between them since Mr. Whitfield's revelations. His proposal, when it came, was delivered with every evidence of genuine feeling, yet its timing and circumstances made it impossible for her to receive it with the joy that such addresses should inspire in ladies of sensible disposition. His words spoke of admiration for her character and intelligence, of the compatibility that had developed between them despite the obstacles that their previous circumstances had created, and of his desire to offer her the protection of his name and position. Yet beneath his eloquent expressions of regard, she detected notes of relief that suggested motivations extending beyond simple romantic attachment. His references to the happiness that their union might bring seemed to encompass considerations of material as well as emotional satisfaction, creating ambiguities that her sensitive nature could not ignore. Her response to his proposal was perhaps the most difficult speech she had ever been called upon to deliver. She acknowledged the honor of his address with gratitude that was entirely sincere, expressed appreciation for the regard he had shown her throughout their acquaintance, and admitted to feelings that made his proposal all the more precious to her heart. Yet she found herself unable to accept an offer whose motivations remained unclear, requesting time for consideration that she hoped might resolve the doubts that tormented her about his true intentions. Lord Greystone's reaction to her request for delay was perfectly correct, yet she could not escape the impression that her hesitation had surprised him more than disappointed him. His assurances that he would await her decision with whatever patience she might require were delivered with courtesy that seemed to mask calculations about the obstacles to their union that she might be contemplating. When he withdrew to allow her the solitude necessary for proper reflection, his manner suggested confidence that time would resolve whatever scruples were preventing her immediate acceptance. Yet as Evangeline remained in the garden after his departure, surrounded by the fading beauty of autumn flowers that seemed to mirror her own uncertain situation, she found herself confronting questions about love and honor that would determine not only her own happiness, but the integrity of whatever relationship might develop between them. The possibility that Lord Greystone's proposal might be motivated primarily by financial necessity cast shadows over declarations that should have filled her heart with unalloyed joy, creating dilemmas that seemed to offer no resolution satisfactory to both prudence and romantic feeling. The letter she began composing that evening, intended to clarify her feelings while requesting the additional time needed to resolve her doubts, would remain unfinished as events conspired to transform their situation in ways that neither of them could have anticipated. For sometimes Providence arranges tests of character that reveal truths about the human heart that mere comfortable circumstances might never illuminate. and Evangeline was about to discover whether Lord Greystone's regard for her could survive challenges that would strip away every consideration save the essential question of love itself. The morning of October the 29th brought with it the kind of crisp clarity that often follows storms, as though the very air had been washed clean of deception and pretense. Evangeline had spent much of the previous evening in her chamber, struggling to compose a response to Lord Greystone's proposal that would honor both her feelings and her doubts, when circumstances arose that would render such careful diplomacy unnecessary. The catalyst for transformation came in the form of an urgent message that arrived just as the household was preparing to retire, bearing news that would test every assumption about character and motivation that recent events had established. The message concerned developments at Greymont Park's home farm, where a fire in the main barn had threatened not only valuable harvests, but several cottages housing tenant families with young children. Lord Greystone's immediate response to this crisis provided Evangeline with insights into his character that no amount of drawing room conversation could have revealed. Without hesitation or regard for his appearance, he had mounted his horse and ridden through the night to coordinate efforts to contain the fire and ensure the safety of those whose livelihoods depended upon his stewardship of the estate. Evangeline learned these details from Mrs. Richardson, the steward's wife, who had arrived at the great house seeking assistance for the families whose homes had been damaged in the conflagration. The practical needs of the situation, temporary shelter, clothing for children whose belongings had been destroyed, medical attention for those who had suffered from smoke inhalation, created demands that transcended the usual boundaries between social classes and revealed character in ways that formal entertainments never could. Her response to these needs was immediate and instinctive, drawing upon resources of compassion and practical competence that her 3 years as a dependent had taught her to develop. Working alongside Mrs. Richardson and the estate's housekeeper, she helped organize emergency accommodation for displaced families, supervised the preparation of food and medical supplies, and used her needlework skills to repair damaged clothing and create makeshift bedding for children who would otherwise have spent the night in considerable discomfort. The work was exhausting and occasionally heartbreaking, requiring her to set aside every consideration of propriety and social distinction in favor of simple human necessity. Her elegant morning dress became stained with soot and torn by brambles as she helped evacuate possessions from threatened cottages, while her carefully arranged hair fell victim to wind and exertion as she assisted with the physical labor that the crisis demanded. Yet she had never felt more authentically herself than during those hours when her actions were governed solely by the desire to alleviate suffering, rather than maintain appearances or advance personal interests. It was during the darkest hours before dawn, when exhaustion had stripped away every social pretense and revealed the essential nature of those involved in the night's efforts, that she encountered Lord Greystone returning from his supervision of the firefighting efforts. His appearance bore witness to his complete engagement with the crisis. His clothes were blackened with smoke and dirt, his hair disheveled from hours of physical labor, and his face marked by the kind of weariness that comes from shouldering responsibility for others' welfare without regard for personal comfort. Yet it was the expression in his gray eyes when they fell upon her that provided the revelation she had been seeking about his true character. Here was no calculated assessment of her value as a matrimonial prospect, no strategic evaluation of her usefulness in resolving his financial difficulties. Instead, she saw recognition of a kindred spirit whose response to crisis matched his own instinct to place duty and compassion above personal considerations. The look that passed between them in that moment carried understanding that transcended every barrier of rank and circumstance that society had erected to govern their relationship. Their conversation in the gray light of dawn was brief yet profound, encompassing assessments of the damage sustained and plans for rebuilding that would ensure tenant families suffered no lasting hardship from the night's disasters. Yet beneath these practical concerns flowed currents of meaning that addressed questions far more significant than mere estate management. His gratitude for her assistance was expressed in terms that recognized her efforts as those of an equal partner rather than a charitable volunteer, while his obvious assumption that she would continue to participate in restoration efforts spoke to expectations of shared responsibility that went beyond temporary crisis management. When he proposed that they ride together to inspect the damaged buildings and assess what materials and labor would be required for repairs, his invitation carried implications that extended far beyond immediate practical necessity. The partnership he envisioned was not that of employer and assistant or even of host and guest, but of two people united by common values and mutual respect in addressing challenges that affected their shared community. The ride through the estate that morning provided opportunities for conversation that were both more natural and more revealing than any of their previous encounters. Away from the constraints of formal entertainment and social protocol, they spoke with the easy intimacy of old friends about subjects ranging from agricultural improvement to tenant welfare to the philosophical questions that arose when comfort and privilege were confronted with genuine need. His observations about the responsibilities that accompanied inherited position were delivered without pretense or calculation, revealing character that had been shaped by serious consideration of moral obligation rather than mere social expectation. Most significantly, his references to future plans for the estate assumed her continued presence and participation in ways that had nothing to do with her recently revealed inheritance. His comments about improvements to tenant housing, educational opportunities for estate children, and agricultural innovations that might benefit the broader community were delivered with expectation of her interest and input that spoke to respect for her judgment rather than gratitude for her resources. It was during their examination of the damaged barn, as they stood together in the ruins contemplating the work that would be required to restore it to usefulness, that Lord Greystone returned to the question of their personal relationship with directness that swept away all remaining ambiguity about his motivations. His renewed proposal was delivered with passionate sincerity that left no room for doubt about the genuine nature of his feelings. Yet it was accompanied by revelations about his financial circumstances that demonstrated complete honesty about the practical considerations that might influence her decision. His estate, he acknowledged, was indeed burdened with debts that threatened its long-term viability, yet recent improvements in agricultural practices and careful management had begun to restore its profitability in ways that might eventually eliminate those obligations entirely. More importantly, he made clear that his proposal was not contingent upon her inheritance. Indeed, he urged her to consider whether she might not prefer to maintain her independence rather than linking her fortune to his uncertain prospects. The offer he made was not merely of marriage, but of partnership in endeavors that would extend far beyond personal happiness to encompass shared responsibility for the welfare of those whose lives depended upon their decisions. His vision of their future together emphasized collaboration rather than subordination, mutual support rather than financial dependency, and common purpose rather than mere romantic feeling. Her acceptance, when it came, was delivered with joy that had been purified of every doubt about his character or motivations. Standing amid the ashes of disaster that their joint efforts had helped to transform into opportunities for renewal and improvement, she gave him her hand and her heart with confidence that their union would be founded upon values solid enough to withstand whatever trials their future might bring. The wedding that followed 6 weeks later was celebrated in the parish church at Greymont, surrounded by tenant families whose lives had been touched by their joint efforts during the October crisis. The ceremony itself was simple yet profound, emphasizing sacred promises rather than social display, and the celebration that followed brought together representatives of every level of society whose welfare had become their shared concern. Lady Margaret's initial disappointment at what she considered an inadequate match for one whose inheritance might have commanded greater social elevation gave way to grudging respect for Lord Greystone's evident devotion to his bride and his practical competence in estate management. Helena's marriage to Lord Pembroke's son had proceeded with equal success, creating happiness that validated romantic feeling while securing social advancement that satisfied even her mother's ambitious expectations. As the new Viscountess Greystone settled into her role as mistress of Greymont Park, Evangeline discovered that her greatest joy lay not in the elevation of her circumstances, but in the opportunity to employ her abilities in service of causes that extended beyond personal comfort or social recognition. The partnership she had formed with her husband proved as intellectually stimulating as it was emotionally satisfying, encompassing shared interests that ranged from agricultural innovation to educational reform, to the countless small acts of stewardship that transformed estate management from mere business into moral calling. On a morning in early December, when the first snow of winter had transformed the Derbyshire landscape into something approaching fairy tale beauty, the Viscountess Greystone stood not in an elegant drawing room, but upon a hill overlooking the home farm, her husband beside her as they surveyed the fruits of their joint labors. Below them, the newly constructed barn roof gleamed beneath its coating of pristine snow, a structure risen from the ashes of October's disaster through their shared determination and the willing hands of tenants who had become partners in renewal. The look that passed between them in that moment of perfect stillness spoke not of society's conventions or fortune's favors, but of the quiet partnership and profound understanding that had grown between two souls who had discovered their truest worth not in the world's recognition, but in their capacity to build something lasting from the ruins of what had come before. And so another tale of hearts united reaches its blessed conclusion. Love, it seems, finds a way even through the strictest conventions of proper society, yet its greatest triumph comes not in conquering obstacles, but in creating partnerships worthy of the challenges that true affection must inevitably face. In a world where birth and fortune too often determine the boundaries of possibility, the union of Damien and Evangeline stood as testament to the power of character and compatibility to transcend every artificial barrier that prejudice might erect to keep kindred souls apart.